Hello and welcome back to International School History Teacher. Today I want to look at a question that regularly causes problems for my students and which has become a central component of most history examinations around the world. The question is, of course, what makes an historical source useful? A long time ago, in September 1994 to be precise, and thanks to Jordana Bynan of Class 2A for making a copy of this on the whiteboard, I developed what has become known as the 3R's approach to source evaluation. That is, when considering the extent to which a source might be useful to our inquiry into the past, we ask the 3R questions about that source. Is it relevant? How revealing is it? And is that source reliable? The first question you need to ask when considering the utility of a source is whether it's relevant. Now, relevance always depends upon the questions we ask. For example, the Bayeux Tapestry is undoubtedly one of the most valuable medieval sources that we have, and despite being a source about warfare in Normandy, it can contribute very little to our understanding of the Normandy D-Day landings of 1944 because it isn't relevant to that later event.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
But if I was interested in questions about medieval warfare, then it becomes relevant. If I ask questions about what Norman knights looked like in 1066, then it becomes particularly relevant because such visual sources are so rare. And the Bayeux Tapestry, in this respect, is particularly valuable. It is therefore the question that makes the source more or less relevant. So the second of our 3R questions is concerned with how revealing the source is. And this does not simply mean how much information the source reveals about the past. It also is concerned with how the knowledge of the past is conveyed and the type of source that is doing the conveying. I therefore like to distinguish between the quantity and the quality of what the source reveals. Quantity is easy to understand. The more information the source contains, the more valuable the source is. For example, the 1932 election results in Germany are useful in helping us explain why Hitler came to power. This table of election results covers all the years of Weimar Germany and provides us with more information than the results of 1932 alone, and is therefore more useful. If we're interested in the evolution of the Nazi vote, we can take this information and plot a graph in which we compare the rise in Nazi support with the rise of unemployment in the Depression. Now, this graph provides more information and even suggests a logical correlation between unemployment and Nazi support. But no amount of richly detailed statistics or carefully constructed graphs can fully help us explain why the people supported the Nazis. For this, we need a different quality of source that can help understand what individuals are thinking, the type of source that helps us begin to empathize and understand human motivation. We know that in the early 1920s, Italian fascists and German Nazis recruited heavily from ex-soldiers who'd been traumatized by the experience and the horrors of the First World War. To begin to understand those horrors, we can review their personal memoirs or the novels and poetry that were produced. Or we can contemplate the visual art. Sometimes what is useful in a source cannot be expressed in words, which is indeed why such visceral sources are so valuable. Of course, we cannot generalize from the highly subjective impressions of individuals. This is the obvious limitation of such sources. But without their empathetic power to move us, our understanding of the past is as superficial as that of a weekending holidaymaker trying to make sense of the culture of a foreign country. The third R question is the one examiners are most interested in, that is, how reliable a source is, whether what the source says can or cannot be trusted. This is a good test of your historical knowledge because to answer it well, you need to reflect on both the content of what the source says, but also on who is saying it. The reliability of an historical source heavily depends on its origin. A consideration of this origin leads us to ask the three little W questions: who produced the source, when, and where was the source produced? This in turn leads to the big W question of why the source was produced, or what the International Baccalaureate likes to call the purpose of the source. Let's look at why these little W questions might be important. The importance of who, that is, who produced the source, is easy to understand. Knowing who the individual is gives us clues about what the source is likely to say. Knowing the source is produced by a Marxist-Leninist or by a royalist conservative is likely to be significant. If we find ourselves thinking, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Then the who is important. Consider this cartoon about an industrial dispute. Newspapers are big businesses and are generally hostile to organised labour. They will provide a different perspective to that of the trade unionists who are organising the strike. Now, this cartoon uses an informal fallacy called the slippery slope. Support for the union will lead to communism later. But who is not just about the different personalities and their social divisions. Politicians, cartoonists, statesmen, journalists, poets and photographers all have different purposes when they produce the things that the past leaves behind. For example, the view we have on 19th century African imperialism will depend on whether we privilege the accounts of English missionaries like Alice Seeley Harris, whose photographs of mutilated Africans helped turn the world's opinion against King Leopold's genocidal regime in the Congo, or English colonialists like Cecil Rhodes, whose fortune made from his mining exploits made him a hero right the way across the British Empire. And don't forget that the importance of who also applies to the historians whose accounts you are often expected to evaluate. As E.H. Carr said in What is History? Study the historian before you begin to study the facts. What bees has he in his bonnet? When you read a work of history, always listen out for the buzzing. If you can detect none, either you are tone deaf or your historian is a dull dog. When analysing the reliability of an historical source, the question of when it was produced is often foremost in the student's mind. Unfortunately, at some point, they have been taught the largely useless distinction between primary and secondary sources, and this often leads to the sort of comments that cause examiners some distress. For example, this source is reliable because the author was there at the time. This is a British newspaper from October 1938. It is from the day after the Munich meeting in which the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met Adolf Hitler to resolve the crisis in Czechoslovakia. This newspaper was written by the people who were there at the time. There are reports from journalists who were there with Chamberlain in Munich during the conference, but do they provide reliable judgments on the treaty? Are they accurate assessments of Nazi policy? For more reliable accounts of Munich in 1938, we need to turn to the historians who have over decades pored over the once secret documents, interpreting and reinterpreting what was actually happening behind the scenes, and who've made judgments, historical judgments, in the light of what actually happened later. Of course, without eyewitnesses to the past, we would know very little indeed, but simply being there doesn't guarantee reliability. These newspapers do give a useful account of how Chamberlain was celebrated. It helps explain why the government followed the policy of appeasement. Being unreliable doesn't mean that it is useless.
And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
From Heston, a triumphal progress as Mr. Chamberlain drives to report immediately to His Majesty the King at Buckingham Palace. And in this, perhaps the most historic spot of the Empire's capital, let the people themselves speak what is in their hearts.
The final W question is where the source was produced. Now, one of the easiest ways for you to understand the importance of where is to look at two school history textbooks written about the same event in two different countries. The year I started teaching in 1993, Wales was given its own history curriculum that was different from the English curriculum for the very first time. And almost overnight, we went from teaching how the Normans conquered Britain to how the Welsh resisted the English. In any conflict, knowing which side the author of the source was on will help you make judgments about its reliability. The Cold War is a particularly good example of this because it was, at least partly, a war of ideas in which winning arguments was of paramount importance. Neither side was a reliable source about what the other side was doing. Of course, the Soviet Union was an authoritarian dictatorship with information strictly controlled by the state. But the USA was also routinely involved in secret military actions preventing the spread of communism and overthrowing democratically elected regimes all around the world. But they couldn't say that, could they?
This is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given. And we are sure that under your leadership, supported by the people whom I have met by the hundreds on my visit to Guatemala, that Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people. Thank you very much for allowing us to see this exhibit of communism in Guatemala. You're welcome.
The second dimension of reliability concerns the actual content of what the source says. This is often closely tied into the origin of the source and for obvious reasons is more difficult to generalize about. But there are certainly some themes to look out for. The first thing to ask is whether the source is factual, because if it is, it can be checked. If you can't verify something, then it can't be reliable. This is philosopher Karl Popper's principle of falsification. Consider this extract from the 1911 census in Britain. Is it reliable? Yes, because it's official, and the methods used to produce the data were scientific. And most importantly, it is reliable because it is factual and can be checked. And I've checked it. That's my grandmother. I know when and where she was born, and I know she was living in that house in 1911. It is reliable. This is why you have to provide references for those essays you write, so that the claims you make can at some point be checked against reliable factual sources. This is what we mean by corroboration, when two or more independent accounts agree with each other. This is Paul Revere's famous engraving of the Boston Massacre of March 1770, and this shows Captain Preston ordering the Redcoats to fire on the innocent civilians of Boston. But did he order the Redcoats to fire? The Boston Gazette newspaper from March the 12th corroborates Revere's image. It says that in response to the snowball throw in public, the captain commanded them to fire. But importantly, this is not the only view. It is a view contradicted by the London Chronicle newspaper and by Preston's own statement given at his trial, in which he says a shot was fired spontaneously by one of his men who was being attacked, and then all was confusion with shots fired in, I quote, a hurry. This is why in exam papers you are asked to compare and contrast sources, because this is what historians do. Does it matter who fired first?
I bet you have.
Well, yes, it changes everything. Which brings me on to the question of objectivity. For the Patriots, what happened in Boston was a massacre. For the English, it was a mere incident. Words matter. When we looked at the origin and purpose of the source, we examined the reasons why it might be unreliable. When looking at the content, we are looking for evidence of that unreliability. and this is where your English lessons will come in handy. Is the language of the source objective and measured, or is it emotive and persuasive? Is the author using rhetorical devices? Is there hyperbole and exaggeration? Are the questions loaded? Is there any evidence of ideological construct or ideological language? Are the factory owners captains of industry or the exploiting bourgeoisie?
The bourgeoisie this is the bourgeoisie that!
And it's not just language that needs to be taken into consideration. The same questions may be asked of photographs, the visual arts, and the political cartoons so beloved of examiners. I find that photographs in particular cause problems for my students, who are often reduced to repeating variations of the aphorism that the camera never lies. Photographs are framed in both time and space. The photographer makes a conscious decision to exclude both the outside of the frame and the moment before and after the shutter is pressed. Which brings me to my final question to ask of the content of a source. Is it complete? This is my favourite way to illustrate why it matters if the source is complete. This is a famous photograph by Thomas Hopke, a German photographer. It shows a group of friends enjoying a morning in the sun. The meaning of the image changes dramatically, however, when we put it into a wider, more complete perspective, in both space and time.
In the sunshine over Gramercy.
It is exactly the same with other sources, which may have been edited and presented inevitably out of context. Is the extract really typical of the author? Why did the statistics only show those countries in those particular years? And are all the questions of the survey included?
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favor of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told, you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions and they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those.
Now this encourages the problems which in psychology are called heuristic biases. We tend to make general conclusions from incomplete, oversimplified and unrepresentative evidence. So as well as inquiring about the origin and purpose of the source, we should also be concerned with how that source has been presented and what wider context may have been left out. In conclusion, source analysis is not easy. But the source analysis activities invented by exam boards in the 1970s to give students something else to do other than write essays look likely to be with us for quite some time to come. That said, the fundamental skills they encourage are useful and worth developing, even if the high-pressure exams against the clock seem to have very little to do with the sedate world inhabited by the professional historian. Students do need to understand that the past can only be reconstructed from the evidence that the past has left behind, reconstructed by historians who take great care to consider whether the evidence has any value to the stories that they tell. Thanks for watching.
Architecture of amnesia, scare the people with hysteria. Architecture of amnesia, history lesson.